It's my pleasure to introduce Sean Stein, President of the U.S.-China Business Council. Sean's former boss was our speaker last year, but it's much more handsome than Craig Allen, you know. And I've known Sean for a while and interacted, and he's going to bring to this conversation more than 2 decades of experience. It's over 25 years now, yeah, exactly, at the forefront of sort of U.S.-China relations. Before leading the Business Council, he served 3 decades, so he was, as a career diplomat, and he's telling me these countries he was a diplomat before going to China, and I don't even remember their names. But then he was the Consul General in both Shanghai and Shenyang, 2 of the America's most important diplomatic posts in China. And his leadership in these spanned this time of transition of the rising tension in the bilateral relationships. I can't remember the head of the Chengdu consulate in the mid-2000s, and it was like all she had to do was take people out to see pandas, right, and then take them down to the boat where they went down the Yangtze, and that was U.S.-China relations were so well. But following diplomatic service, Sean continued to bridge the world of policy and business as a senior advisor at Covington and Burling. That means he's an economist and a lawyer at the same time, right? Americans don't like politicians. They're our number one word, but economists and lawyers are number 2. Yeah. But you're a nice guy, Sean, and but he's helped this company navigate the complex political and regulatory environment in China, and I think that's where a lot of the experience comes from. So his current role at U.S.-China Business Council, he leads organization efforts to promote constructive engagement and dialogue between the U.S. and China's business communities at a time when that dialogue has never been more important or challenging. We're honored to have him here today to share those insights on sort of this evolving U.S.-China relationship we've been listening to all the day. But I think what he can give us more than anyone is sort of insights into what the U.S. business community inside China is dealing with, is confronting, is in how they're solving problems and what problems are they not able to solve. And so please join me to thank Sean for coming.
Okay. So thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's really great to be here, an honor to be here with this great program after such amazing panels. I have to say, I don't know when the last was that there was so much interesting discussion at a conference. And so congratulations on getting such an amazing group. And I'm looking right down here at both Dan and Arthur, and I'm like, those are the 2 people that really inspired me at different times to think more deeply about China. I remember back in 2010, Arthur will have no recollection of this, he was invited to speak to the consuls general from folks around China. Maybe it was 2011, and we're sitting in this little Italian restaurant, and I was like, wow, I've never thought of things this way. And so it inspired me to go out and buy his book, so I recommend it. There's probably now a new edition. And then for Dan, Dan taught me something really important. Not just the importance of reading China policy statements in depth to see what they mean, but also to see how they're interpreted by Chinese entrepreneurs and the Chinese business elite. And so that's also shaped a lot about how I think. So as I've told many of you earlier, what I had planned to talk about today was the grand arc of U.S.-China relations from the Obama administration to the present, and how there's this consistent theme that got us to where we are. But what just happened? We just had Geneva. And so I feel like since I was fortunate enough, or if that's the right word, to have sort of a front row seat to what's happened in the U.S.-China trade war, I thought what I would talk about instead, because we just had the breakthrough in Geneva, I want to talk a little bit about what happened there and how we got to where we are, and maybe what comes next. Does that sound fair? All right, so the first person that ever taught me anything about China was, for the State Department, he was the deep China thinker. He was the Mr. China. More than perhaps anyone else, shaped for years how we thought about China. And that was the estimable Stapleton Roy, who I bet everybody here knows, or at least everyone has heard of. And so I was working with him in Jakarta in the late 90s. And I was his +1 to an event. And I don't remember who it was. I remember where it was. But I remember it was someone speaking about geopolitics. And it was a former foreign minister or something. And so I'm his plus one, and we're sitting there. And I don't remember what he said, the speaker. But I remember he got to a point, and he said, and to quote from The Art of War, Sun Tzu, and then Stape leans over to me and he says, anytime anyone refers to the art of war, that's permission to tune out. Nothing else is going to be of value. And then he pulls out his newfangled Palm Pilot and starts to play Free Cell. And so I learned two very important things. First thing I learned was I needed a Palm Pilot. And the second was never refer to the art of war. And so I do not intend to change that. In the 20 years I've been working on China, I have never quoted the art of war. And I also look at that as permission to mentally check out. So I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to quote the great American poet, and I wonder if anybody even knows him, Zach de la Rocha. Who knows who Zach de la Rocha is? Who's Zach? I'll give you a hint. That's right. He's a rage poet, right, from Rage Against the Machine, a band that probably couldn't even play at Stanford. And essentially he says what? If you're going to go to war, you got to what? You got to know your enemy. And by implication, you got to know yourself. And so when we're talking about a trade war with the United States and China, when I look at how it's played out, from beginning to end so far, up through Geneva, it's been characterized by the U.S. making that very fundamental mistake of not knowing its enemy and not knowing itself. And so I want to talk a little bit about the things that we've been talking about with the Trump administration from before the trade war, and then how it played out in practice and what that might mean for business going forward. Fair? All right, I'm going to go fast. So early on, even before this started, we were talking to members of the administration about what was to come. And it became readily apparent from early on, even before inauguration and after inauguration, that there were several things that we felt the Trump administration got wrong. And I'm not talking about policy. I'm not talking about disagreements over the utility of tariffs or export controls or any of that, but fundamental basic facts about China, because our belief was that whatever your policy outcome is, if you're not basing it upon facts or the reality, then you're not going to get what you're looking for. It's not going to be successful. And so the first thing, I remember sitting with someone who then became a Senate-confirmed member of the cabinet, and we were talking about the roadmap for where we were going with China. And I told him I was worried about what happens if we go after China in a way that's too aggressive. And he said something that stuck with me that I then heard from all over the administration, not just from this one person. But he said, we learned during Trump 1.0 something very important, and that is China can't really hurt us. In other words, China's retaliation isn't really a thing. And I was like, tell me more. And he said, what did we see during the first administration? We saw that they hit us with everything they had, quote unquote. They hit agriculture, they hit licenses and permits, and they hit us with tariffs, and yet we had no inflation, our agriculture sector was fine, etc. And so the more that I talked to people around the administration, the more we saw that there was very much a discounting of how much Chinese retaliation might hurt. So we did a very quick study where we talked to our members saying, what are things you're worried about with retaliation? And gave this list to the administration. And interestingly enough, as I'd mentioned to someone at lunch, one of the things that was on that list that our companies were really worried about is what if they finally pull the trigger and go after rare earths? And when we talked about that around the administration, we got crickets. We didn't get any great interest. It was like, this is more, hyperbole from the business community until the very, very end. So that was the first big thing that caused us to worry, is underappreciating China's ability to hit back. And why is that? Because anyone who'd spent time in China from 2018 onward knew that China was frustrated that its response to the US during the first trade war was essentially limited to some sort of reciprocity, to some sort of, well, you tariff us, we'll tariff you. And they didn't have the legal framework or the tools to retaliate in any sort of more organized mechanism. And so what we hear now, though, when we talk to Chinese policymakers and folks close to them, is if during Trump 1.0 the answer to tariffs was reciprocity, now the word that we often hear is asymmetry. How do we go after the US in ways that hurt the US more than they hurt us? That was number one. Number two, and this I think is very common, and this has come up in a number of the things we've talked about today. The second really big fallacy that we see is folks will say, well, China's economy is so weak that U.S. tariffs and U.S. pressure on their economy is going to force them to do the types of things that we want them to do. And so very much an overestimating the leverage that tariffs and other things like export controls or sanctions give the U.S. over China, or create an opportunity for the U.S. to shape China's behavior in ways that the U.S. wants that to happen. And that was something that we've also warned them over, that not to overestimate that. Some of the work that we've seen from Arthur, for example, talks about now, I think, direct trade between the United States and China is less than 3% of GDP. And so the numbers and the type of leverage that we think we have is not what some policymakers in the U.S. wishes. There's a lot of others that I might mention, but let me just go after two. Another one is this belief that I find baffling that seems to permeate parts of the policymaking structure in Washington, is that there is somehow some fragility to the CCP. We've been in meetings at the White House, very senior meetings at the White House, where they talk about fragility, which we do not see. Instead, what we've seen is that since the beginning of the trade war, particularly since April 2nd, something that surprised me, I was in China on April 2nd, how quickly the mood shifted. Even among China's elite, which tends to be rather pro-US because they've set up companies, they've done business, and they recognize, the strength of the US system. What we saw after April 2nd was this rally around the flag. So folks that would normally never say anything nice about the Chinese administration, who are Chinese, really were like, oh, well, but we're all Chinese, we all need to sort of rally around and support against this sort of aggressiveness by the United States. So I think that was underestimated. The last thing which I wanted to mention is in dialogue with the administration. There is an overwhelming sense that the only market that matters is the US market. And when we talk to them about the importance of the Chinese market, they'll say, well, of course you would say that. Or when we talk to them about, well, in fact, the European market or Southeast Asian market, et cetera, are really important. That is absolutely undervalued. And so we've had numerous conversations at very high levels with the US government where our companies will sort of make those cases, and they get this sort of look like, well, the US market is so strong, why would you need these other markets? Where in point of fact, in many cases, either the China market or the ex-US market is more important than the US market. And so the fact that you are here at this conference means all of those things to you sound absolutely nonsensical. But those are some of the themes that have permeated policymaking with China, certainly since the beginning of the Trump administration, in some cases since before that. And so those are some of the things where I think that's caused us to sort of go astray. So how has this worked out in practice? So even before Inauguration Day, the Chinese were talking to the incoming administration, and it was clear that a big issue was going to be fentanyl. And so in February, the Chinese government gave a written proposal to the administration on, here's what we're going to do on fentanyl. And to me, a layman, it looked very credible. When we talked about the details to some folks in the pharmaceutical industry, they're like, wow, that would be really disruptive. That would be a really big step. And so they make this presentation to the administration and didn't hear back. But at the same time, the Chinese were signaling, we know the US is going to do some things we don't like. We know they're going to do things like maybe tariffs. But as long as it's reasonable, then we can absorb that because they're going to have to do something, and then we can come to some sort of negotiated settlement. And so from the beginning, they were using two words. And it didn't matter if I was in Beijing or if I was in Washington or where I was hearing the same phrase. This was the talking points that have been blasted out through the system. And it was, we will talk and we'll negotiate with respect, but we will not beg, and we will not be bullied. And so we watched this play out in real time when we had the first 10% tariffs go into effect on China. And I'm going to remember these were IEEPA tariffs, and they were there because of fentanyl. And I'll never forget, on that Saturday, the news was all about Gloria Steinbaum from Mexico flying to Washington to talk about what Mexico was going to do. And then we had Justin Trudeau come from the north to talk about, here's what Canada's going to do. And I'm talking to the Chinese, like, yeah, that's not what we're going to do. We're not going to beg. That we don't play that. And so what China did, as everyone knows, is they put tariffs on some manufactured goods, some agricultural equipment, did some other things in terms of response. But that Monday, the Monday that those things went into effect, I watched the White House press briefing, and we had Kathleen Leavitt, the White House press spokesman, said, well, these went into effect, but the two presidents are going to talk in the next 24 to 36 hours. Then that afternoon on Fox Business, we had Peter Navarro, White House proxy, say, yeah, I don't want to get ahead of the boss, but the two leaders are going to talk in the next 24 to 36 hours. So what do? We do what anyone else does, what probably half of you did. We waited 24 to 36 hours and started to look for readouts. Nothing in Xinhua, nothing in People's Daily, nothing from the White House, nothing at all. So we do what most of you probably did. We ring up the White House and we ring up the Chinese and like, hey, how was the discussion? And we got, from the White House, we got, the funniest thing, the Chinese didn't call. And we're like, and that surprised you? That was a revelation? That was it? And so for me, that was the moment that sort of showed that all these things where I just said we were getting China wrong, we were overestimating the impact of tariffs, the willingness of the Chinese to beg, et cetera, we got it wrong. And they were genuinely surprised. But the Chinese, they were okay because they thought that their response was not escalatory. So then what happens? The Chinese redouble their efforts to engage the administration on fentanyl. So they have a meeting with one cabinet secretary who says, that's not for me. They write a letter to another cabinet secretary and say, hey, can we talk about our fentanyl proposal? They get nothing. They go to the NSC. They ask for meetings with the White House. No one will talk to them about the fentanyl proposal. So then what happens? So a couple of weeks later, another 10% tariffs go in effect on China for fentanyl. At this point, China's a little irritated. So they respond again in a way that they see as non-escalatory, which I think is incredibly damaging. They went after U.S. agriculture, our number one export to China. They put a 15% tariff on U.S. agriculture and some other things. And then they did other things with export controls and with sanctions. And then they did something that I think surprised the administration, and certainly surprised a lot of the folks I was talking to. They put out an uncharacteristically harsh statement out of the embassy. It was then repeated later for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs back in Washington. And people were calling it the mean tweet because most of us saw it first on Twitter, right? But it was on their website first. And the mean tweet said this: okay, we know it's not about fentanyl, right? And why do they know it's not about fentanyl? Because no one will talk to them about fentanyl. We know it's not about fentanyl, so whatever this is about, bring it on. You want a tariff war? Let's have a tariff war. You want a trade war? We'll have a trade war, or any other kind of war. Then we're ready to do it and pursue it to the end. And so this was China's way of signaling, okay, what is this about? It's clearly not fentanyl. It was their way of sort of expressing frustration. And never has there been a more misinterpreted tweet, I think, in the history of the world. I remember seeing all kinds of blog posts and tweets and other things about how that shows that China's threatening Taiwan. It doesn't show any of those things. It shows China's frustration with the U.S. So, because I want to get to questions, let me fast forward a little bit and get to, after that, the challenge became, how do we get the two sides to talk? So there was a big effort to figure out how to engineer this. And where it landed, and got buy-in theoretically from both sides, was that since neither side had enough trust of the other side to really engage too directly, right? Neither side had the patience to engage in an 18-month negotiation like phase one. Neither side had any of this. Then the idea was, how do we break this up into small, if you're the White House, you call it deals. If you're the Chinese, you call it confidence-building measures, and set out an escalatory ladder of action on the Chinese side, reaction on the US. The things started to move that way. But then Liberation Day happened, and the mood changed completely. And this is where, again, we saw, I think, the U.S. misread or misunderstanding of China really caused a lot of damage. And that's because the U.S. did not expect China to retaliate. And I think anyone that had been talking to the Chinese knew that China was going to retaliate, that they would not be able to not retaliate. And so I remember I was in Beijing and had just talked to folks at the embassy and said, there's going to be retaliation. This is going to be bad. They're like, no. They get the message, they're not going to retaliate. And of course, they retaliated, and we got into this massive triple-digit sort of spiral that did enormous damage. Even though it was short, did enormous damage to the U.S. economy. Did some significant damage to the Chinese economy. And maybe we can get into how that worked in sort of practice. But sort of in closing then, let me just talk about a couple of the things that happened, even though that period of triple-digit tariffs didn't extend for very long. let me talk about some of the things that happened. We had hundreds of US manufacturing jobs during that time moved overseas. And they moved overseas not necessarily because of the need to evade Chinese tariffs, but they moved because the US tariffs made the US too high cost a production base to then re-export to the rest of the world. One example, a medium-sized US company with several billion dollars of exports per year, 1/3 of their global exports goes to China, the rest goes to the rest of the world. I remember meeting with their CEO and he said, look, I knew that we would have this tariff war and this trade war with China and that I'd lose all of my China market. That's okay, that's only 1/3 of my global market. What I didn't get is how high prices would go coming from China. And so now, even though I import from China less than 1/7 what I export to China, what I import from China isn't shoes or garments or televisions, it's raw materials that go into what I manufacture for the rest of the world. Now with these tariffs, I'm priced out of the rest of the world. So I didn't just lose my market in China, I'm losing my market globally. We have other companies who talked about the need to then rebalance production out of the United States to places like Malaysia and to Thailand and to elsewhere so that they could remain globally competitive. More alarming was a meeting that I had that was a chance meeting and then followed up with. As I was leaving my hotel to come back here from Shanghai, in the lobby of my hotel was the China CEO of a very, 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 very large European conglomerate, one of the best known European companies that's involved in everything from semiconductors to new materials to name it, they're involved. And I was like, what are you doing? You live here. Why are you here at this hotel so early? He said, oh, it just so happens we're having a board meeting. And I was like, oh, well, that's well-timed. And and he said, well, yeah, but it was planned, almost a year ago. It just so happens that we're here this weekend. And I was like, how's it going? He said, oh, well, I'll tell you how it's going, and you're going to hate how it's going. I said, fair enough. He said, over the last number of years, we've spent a lot of money focusing on our capacity in China. We've been in China for Asia, in North America for the Americas, and they kind of duke it out over the rest of the world. But now we're moving to, and this is what our board is talking about, because of the tariffs and unpredictability, we're now going from that model to what could very well become an in China, for China, and the world -1. And the -1 is, of course, the US market. So, of course, after that, I've tested that with a number of European companies, and there's this growing European skepticism of the ability to invest in the US market because of the predictability and favoring the China market as a source of investment or as a place to invest because of a variety of reasons. But that's what's come because of this short period of triple-digit tariffs. It will have lasting impact on the US economy. And so we got all of the downside of tariffs and the trade war, and we're getting none of the upside because of how it's been executed. So all that is to say that I'm the person that has spent years beating up on China because of its failure to implement previous agreements. I'm the person that has spent years going into MOFCOM, yelling at them about the need to level the playing field, the need to open up government procurement, and all of that, the need to protect IP. And so I find myself in a different place where absolutely those are real issues that we need to continue to fight for. But we also need to have a US policy that's grounded in a real understanding of China and its economy and where it is. Otherwise, to continue to pursue this kind of policy, again, will bring all of the downsides of tariffs and trade wars without bringing any of the upside. So we're in a dangerous time, but fortunately, at least the two sides have called a 90-day hiatus that can give the two sides time to think and reflect. So that's definitely a positive step. Let me stop there, and we can do questions.
Wow, thank you, Sean. Sean had mailed me some ideas he was going to do about the long-term follow-up, and then Sunday happened. And I go, I remember, Matt, we sat there, can we get him to talk about Sunday? Thank you for doing that. And then we said, we don't dare ask you to do that. But I didn't know you had a long plane ride from China.
Yeah,
so I'm sure that's what you were doing on the plane. So I'm going to ask 3 quick questions that are following up, 2 of them that are following up of things that you just said. And then I'm going to open it up. give this talk in the White House or to the executive branch people in commerce or the one you just gave, how do they respond to you, to that?
So we have given that talk in a much gentler way.
Yeah, of course.
To multiple cabinet secretaries, to multiple principals at the White House. I have not been in them, but some of our CEOs have been in to give this brief to the president. And what we've been very clear is that everyone agrees that we want to bring more manufacturing, more investment to the United States. However, the reckless application of tariffs makes that harder and harder to do. And we get a variety of responses. None of them so far have been particularly reassuring. We had one meeting where we were talking about both the employment effects and the effect on investment, both in the United States and overseas, of triple-digit tariffs. And what we got was, this is just a short-term problem, it's going to go away, don't worry about it, it'll all be fine, to it will be, when we talk about the importance of the global market, it'll be like, well, but once the U.S. market really takes off, then, then that will be, you'll understand just how important the U.S. market is. So we haven't felt like we've had, at that level, really a depth of understanding about how the U.S.-China economy works and the long-term impact of tariffs. And so the real question was, do they believe what they're saying to us, or do they just feel like they have to give sort of a party line? And we don't know the answer to that. But none of the meetings did anyone come out of them feeling particularly reassured. In one meeting in particular, I don't want to get into which cabinet or which sort of person, was with financial service firms. And one of the meeting's objectives was to talk about what was the state of the China economy and how did U.S. financial service firms see it playing out. And so imagine, some private equity, imagine some investment bankers, imagine some commercial bankers, imagine a variety of sort of industries. And the answer they came up with is, China's economy has some fundamental weakness. The weakness is not uniform around the country, and you see it in different sectors, but overall, China's economy is not on its knees, and well, it's better than it was last year. And that some of the cyclic problems have probably resolved, and now it's structural. And got enormous pushback from people in the administration saying, well, no, whether we understand their economy is very weak, and that gives us strength. And so I think that our view is there's some very strongly held views within the administration. And while we may agree with the goals of those views, maybe some of the details about how things play out isn't something that we would share.
I see. Yeah, so you just gave us two examples, sort of the bringing in imports at 150%, and even though it's 1/7 of your cost and you can't export to the rest of the world, you're going to hurt U.S. companies right there. And then you had the European companies who are going to take advantage of this. You said twice, this has caused permanent damage to the U.S. economy.
Yeah.
So I want to know, and then Sunday happened, and it's down, and I have a couple buddies. I came over on the flight right before you, the day before you, and when I was over there, I was talking to people, and they said they're going to do some other deals, and it's going to come down more, is it permanent? Or if we do the deal with the Xi Jinping that I love, can it go back to, there's been damage, but is it not permanent? So what do you think of that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So is all of the damage permanent? No. Some of the things can come back. Is some of the damage permanent? Yeah, great example. Have a company based in the South in the United States, one of the largest family-owned firms in the United States, worth multiple billions of dollars, that they have been based in the United States since the 1850s, and the heart and soul of their product has always been manufactured in the United States. But the lesson they learned from COVID, because they sell into global markets, is we have to build resilience into our supply chain. So they build additional capacity in Malaysia. Well, as soon as the tariffs hit, they're like, okay, well, maybe it's time that we ramp up production in Malaysia. We test this out so we can continue to export to the China market, because that is not only our largest market, but because of what we produce goes into China's export machine, then this is our key to global markets through Chinese products. And so what he told me is he said, well, we ramped up in in Malaysia, and in fact, it's going wonderfully. And so will we ever move this back to the US? Probably not. In other cases where things are more fungible, perhaps. So that's one way, that sometimes when manufacturing leaves, it doesn't come back. The other area, though, is that we've had this problem in China for a long time, particularly in tech, where Chinese buyers, even though they need and rely on US technology, in the back of their mind, they worry, will that technology be there in the future? But that's always been in tech. What I just heard on my last visit was even from pharmaceutical companies saying, wow, we're not so sure that you're going to be there when we need you. And so what we're seeing is a tripling down on localization of pharmacology products in China that we would not have seen. And at the same time, what the Chinese authorities are doing is saying, well, you know what, maybe the American companies aren't going to be there. So they're granting permits and other things to Chinese companies and European companies to expand production rapidly in China to displace American producers. And since one of the high points of U.S.-China trade has been in life sciences, this is going to be long-term damage to the U.S. There's other examples, but I think that's two where changes in the U.S. and changes in China that have been put in motion will lead to the lasting damage to the U.S. economy.
Right. So yeah, this isn't, I misunderstood. So this is the overall deterioration of trading of our U.S.-China relations is leading to this permanent damage, not just the most recent 154%
Oh, no, this
tariffs.
is all coming from, sparked by this triple-digit tariffs. Yeah.
That's got it. I wanted to go back to one of the previous sessions, which they've all been so good. And so this is much more general. Japan or not Japan? What is China? And maybe if I can give you my 60-second version. Everybody knows I work on the other China, right? And our most recent paper with Marty White called, the rise of pessimism, right? So, and basically we go to the bottom 560 million people in the labor force, right, who have never been to one day of high school, right? They don't know math, they don't know science, they don't know language, they don't know computers.
That sounds like my hometown.
Yeah. Well, that's are you from Idaho? Yes, exactly. It sounds like my hometown, Bellflower, California. What do they do? And they're 10 years ago, they said, we know inequality is rising very fast, but we're better off 5 years today than we were 5 years ago, and we think we're going to be better off 5 years from now than we are today. It was like 80% of the poor people. Now it's reversed, and 80% of the poor people think that they're going to be worse off 5 years from now, and you see it. I mean, when you go and talk to them, everybody's getting done. By the way, manufacturing is doing that, right? I mean, construction's doing that. So what do we have left? We're left with the service sector, and the rise of service sector, informal service sector jobs are doing this, and everybody's being dumped into the informal sector. They aren't covered by labor laws. They don't have they don't have benefits, that they're sharing jobs, right? We have massive numbers of people who tell us, "Oh, I work Monday to Wednesday, Friday," right? And then my goomer, my best friend works Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. We flip a coin who works on Sunday, and we're making half of what we made, 5 years ago. And that's Mexico, not Japan. I mean, Japan is, we tried to plan our economy, and we have the best TVs, we have the best automobiles, we have the best chemicals in the whole world, but there's 92 industries, and our other 88 industries, didn't do it, right? And so for 30 years they haven't, because we tried to plan our economy. Mexico is, we hit this peak with higher wages, and you got, so Japan or not Japan, Mexico or not Mexico?
Yeah, I think not Japan. I think not Japan. to steal, I think, one of Dan's phrases, because I still think there's a lot of fuel in the tank. And I think that, earlier in the previous panel, there was a lot of discussion about AI. And where I think I come out on this is that at the end of the day, it's not who has the best model, right? A good enough model is a good enough model. Where it really makes a difference is in the application. And what I'm seeing around China, this is going to cause even more of these employment effects that you're talking about that are not going to be good for the poor, the folks who don't have the same education. But where I see China racing ahead in the application of AI. I remember after DeepSeek, SASAC, the organization that supervises the multinationals, put out an instruction and said, all multinationals that we supervise have 90 days to give us their AI implementation plan. And is there going to be a whole lot of mistakes and wasted money and wasted effort? Yes, as always when there's these top-down approaches. But eventually, are they going to start hitting on things that work and that drive productivity? Yeah, probably. At the same time, what we see, and I just heard this from an American company, is we're seeing an explosion of data centers in China that are exploding not because of hyperscalers, but because of these targets that are now being set by SASAC and by other entities. Everyone is setting up their own experimental data center so they can start experimenting with their own DeepSeek and their own applications of AI. So they're one-off small data centers. And then you've got the Huaweis of the world coming up with all the different ways you can apply this to different industrial applications. And so then the idea is that some of these are going to work, and then we're going to get those hyperscaled. So I think that if anybody's going to be poised to benefit from AI, I think the Chinese economy is going to be able to do that. So that's why I think not Japan. I don't think we have endless economic stagnation or a decade of economic stagnation, but I think we have a couple more years until AI starts to bite. And then the last thing, and this is a story I just told somebody, one of the last things I did before I moved to my current job was we were asked by a large, not US, international corporation in pharmaceuticals to set up a deep dive on AI and life science. And so we put together a day-long program where we brought in all of the different Chinese AI experts that we could find to talk about that. Then we took them to various sites. And the most striking thing from that, the shock and awe moment of that, was, mind you, this is a household name company known for its drug discovery. We took them to a fully automated wet lab in the outskirts of Shanghai that works 24 hours a day. And essentially it is 1,000 robotic test stations that test reactions between large molecules, small molecules, enzymes, and all of this, and automatically logs all the data. And you might ask, why do you need billions of data points? And you need the billions of data points because they say right now the limitations on drug discovery using AI is we don't have a good enough training model. And so they're building the training model that's going to be driving drug discovery for the next couple of decades. And while I find that really impressive, what I found really distressing is the head of research for this multinational was floored. He's like, I've never even heard of such a thing. We don't do anything like this. We might have the equivalent of 20 little labs that do this that come up with maybe a few data points a day, not millions of data points per month. And so this is what I mean, where I think that the applications of AI in material science, in life sciences, in pharmaceuticals, in chemical industries, I think there's a lot of potential upside. And I think the Chinese economy is going to be well positioned to benefit from that.
Okay. Not Japan, and let's ignore Mexico. So it's
Yeah.
And, so I've what my work shows is that we're gonna, because we have AI and because we have robots and because we have automation, we're gonna have 200 million people unemployed.
Yeah.
And that I go ask my colleagues in China, they're mostly professionals, academics or businessmen or whoever. I ask them, is this going to turn into Mexico? Where Mexico was one of the safest countries in the world in the 1980s, and it's one of the most violent countries. And everybody says, 70% of the people say there could never be another gang in China because of surveillance, and that we're going to have to worry about taking care of those 200 million people, but it's not going to.
Yeah, well, let me start. So I remember I met with the Jiangsu Party secretary, who I knew from when he was in Shanghai. And he was boasting about something. He says, in the last 8 months, I have closed, I forget the number, 58 factories which had this many workers. And I'm like, wow, in America, you wouldn't brag about that. That's like the reason why you don't get elected. And he laughed and said, no, because, we've got too many of these low value added, high employment industries. We need to move those to the Philippines, he didn't say the Philippines, he said to Bangladesh, to Vietnam, to other places, because I need my workers for higher quality stuff. And so, well, absolutely, there's a huge mass of folks that are going to have a difficult time with employment. In the hyper-developed East, at least, their problem is we've got too many of these low-quality jobs and not enough workers. So I think it's a problem that's not evenly distributed around the country.
So good. Let's open it up for questions. We'll do 1, 2, 3. All right. Deborah.
Hi, that was just amazing, just great. I have what sounds like a historical question at this point, but yesterday I was listening to my colleague Jonas Nahm, who was on the Council of Economic Advisors in the I almost said Obama, in the last administration. And the issue of overcapacity came up, and Jonas said kind of vehemently, he said, I hate that term, overcapacity. He said, how do you measure what is the right capacity? And I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
I agree completely, right? I think that the Chinese have an argument that says no one ever complained about German overcapacity in automobiles, and no one ever complained about American overcapacity in agriculture. But I don't think that means that the overcapacity isn't necessarily a problem. Where I think I see it in China is there's this really cool Chinese word that everyone's going to laugh at my bad pronunciation, neijuan, right? Involution. And I see that as something when I talk to Chinese businesses and Chinese private entrepreneurs where it is a problem. Where it's a problem is when the government indicates there are certain favored industries, let's call them, I don't know, for ease of recognition, something that rolls off the tongue like new quality productive forces. And then everybody's jumping in to dump money into new quality productive forces. And so then what happens is you have businesses that are only able to survive because of various types of subsidies and other mechanisms that allow them to survive. And so then everything becomes competition based on cost. And in that sphere, I think that's where overcapacity, where firms are able to live and die only based on subsidies, that's where I think you have a real problem.
We have somebody in this room who works in an industry in China who gave a talk to my class last year at Peking University for our Stanford Overseas Studies program, who said outside of China, there's 220 chip manufacturers in the world. And inside China, there's 3,100 chip manufacturers. And then he'll go on to solar panel manufacturers, and he'll go on to EV car manufacturers, and he'll go and 7 EV car manufacturers make money, and 92 of them don't. So I think that I've always been struck by those kind of numbers, and see, that's what I say is Japan, right?
Oh, right.
And next, that's a good question, Deborah.
Thanks very much, Sean. And I think your assessment of the assessments or misassessments in the administration are spot on, right? And I don't get the sense yet that it's really changing. So given that, I'm curious to hear your perspective on where you think this goes next, these trade discussions. And my own take so far is that because we came down so quickly in these initial negotiations, my concern is that this is kind of the end rather than the beginning of something more protracted and substantive. And that now we move into kind of the rope-a-dope phase.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I'm laughing because you will appreciate this. I don't know how many people looked at this, but when the Treasury Department and when USTR announced that there were going to be talks in Switzerland, did anybody look at those announcements? I bet a bunch of you did, but I found it amusing because, once upon a time I would write those things, right? And so whether it was from Treasury or from USTR, you've got this long paragraph about the Treasury Secretary will engage in detailed, important negotiations with the Swiss government, talking about blah, 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 blah. Oh, and by the way, he'll meet with his Chinese counterpart, like at the very end. And the one for USTR was even worse, right? It was, we've got these important issues with Switzerland, and at the invitation of the Swiss, oh, and by the way, he'll meet with Jay's counterpart. And so I thought that was kind of cute, right? But the thing is what, right? Why did they have to meet in Switzerland, right? The administration has announced they want to have 18 deals done by July 9th. And it doesn't matter if you're India, if you're Mexico, if you're Canada, if you're the UK, or South Korea, or Vietnam, or the Japanese. Where do you meet to talk about this stuff? Where? Washington, right?
DC.
But the Swiss, we travel to Switzerland for the Swiss, right? So no. So the fact was, why was it necessary for them to do it there? I'll tell you why. I remember back when we were doing this back and forth, trying to get the CBMs in place, right? If you do this, what will we do? And back and forth. And I remember I ran into someone a lot of you know, a vice minister, but who's often one of the leaders of their sort of like delegations to the US. Ran into him because he was in my hotel waiting to meet the deputy prime minister of, I think, Singapore. And so he's there all waiting for me, he calls me over, and so I get through the security line. And he's like, well, everything we talked about, it's dead. And I'm like, why? And he pulls out his WeChat, and he shows me this WeChat video. And the WeChat video is like the administration's greatest hits. And it starts out, I forget what they all were, it starts out with, and of course it's all carefully subtitled for WeChat, it's subtitled in Chinese. And it's Scott Besson saying, China's gambling with a pair of aces. It's the vice president saying it's a bunch of peasants and we're buying stuff from peasants, borrowing money from peasants. And there were a couple of others of them. And then the last one was the US president saying, I've got world leaders calling and coming to kiss my backside to do this. And so anyone who imagines any of us are going to America to talk about this, no, we're not, right? We're not doing this, right? So why do they have to do it in Switzerland? Because no one from China was going to come here. But it was an important enough issue for the US that the US had to hike over to Switzerland, I think, to meet with the Chinese. And so while I think that the fundamental policy of the administration has not changed, I do think that there is, I hope, a greater acknowledgement of just how difficult a Big Bang style transition could be on the US economy. And so we've gotten moved back into the too hard box for now. Second thing I think is that one of the things that I think was also widely misinterpreted, and I remember yelling at Twitter, but which as effective as that is, people would say, well, the Chinese vice minister for public security is going to attend these talks, and that tells you everything you need to know. I'm like, no, it tells you he's their fentanyl czar, and we're going to talk about fentanyl. And so what do I expect to have happen? I expect to have happen is the US is deeply concerned about agriculture. I would bet, knowing absolutely nothing from the US government side, but I would bet we're going to have some fentanyl announcement soon because we want to get some agriculture exports moving again as well. So I think that's what we have in store in the short term. In the longer term, here's what I worry about. The Chinese side is telegraphing that it believes we have a 90-day suspension of all trade actions. Not just a suspension back to April 2nd, but of all trade actions. And why do we think that? We just saw a note from MOFCOM yesterday saying, well, pursuant to our agreement on April 2nd, we are rolling back even our things on export controls and even our sanctions, our things on the unreliable entity list. We're rolling all of this back. Well, we all are also hearing the same thing, that we just saw the announcement on Huawei Ascend chips come out of Department of Commerce on Monday, maybe, which was sort of shocking in how broad it was in terms of saying no one in the world should use Ascend chips without risking violating US export controls. That is a whole new level of long-arm jurisdiction, and we understand there's a large package of firms that are going to be put up on the entity list, hopefully by the end of the month, in the words of, I think, or in the thinking of people at Commerce. So I think China believes we're now in this 90-day stasis, and I don't think that the US necessarily sees it the same way. So I think we could have this rupture where the Chinese will believe the US is acting in bad faith, and the US will believe China is overreacting. But so I don't know if this 10% can hold, and I don't know if we're going to get into another sort of spiral, not in tariffs, but in sanctions, counter-sanctions, and that sort of thing. So I think there's still some other maybe theaters of this trade war that could open up in a way that could be very damaging to the US economy and to the Chinese economy that wouldn't help anybody.
Two quick questions. Let's ask them together, and then you can answer them together.
And I will try not to filibuster, sorry.
No, keep going.
Yeah, actually, very related to the last point. I'm very curious, what lessons do you think China's government specifically has learned about, or maybe adjusted to, negotiating with the United States in the future on all sorts of issues besides just the trade issue, when it can do with also Taiwan-related subjects or the South China Sea? And the same thing applies to what lessons do you think other foreign countries' governments might gain from this that could work against the United States?
Dan?
In the previous trade war, there was a big fear that China will destroy the supply chains of Tesla as well as Apple. I'd always thought that was overstated back then. Is it overstated right now?
Great questions both. On what has China learned? I think what China has learned right now is that, I wouldn't say it's so much a negotiating strategy now, but that the sense I got over the last couple of weeks in China is that not only can we not rely on the United States to be consistent, we can't even rely on the United States to follow through on stuff that it's promised to do. And so that what that tells me as a Chinese policymaker, for example, is that we need to focus on what are our goals and what are our objectives. We need to keep marching in that direction and try to minimize the distraction of what's happening on the U.S. side. That was certainly an attitude I heard from a lot of Chinese policymakers, overwhelmingly on the financial side, but still, that seems to be it. That we don't know what the U.S. is going to do. We know it's not good. We know that half the administration wants to decouple, the other half wants to decouple faster. So we need to focus on our goals and not get too distracted, but impose a cost on the U.S. every time it overacts. I can't say so much for other countries. A number of countries have come to talk to us about how we think China would react to certain types of trade proposals. But I think what I'm seeing from other countries is just a caution that, by and large, relatively few countries, not all, but relatively few countries want to have a clear, stark choice between the U.S. and China, and so we're looking to see how to split the difference and trying to understand how we think China may react. But that's what I think, is I think China's going to try to keep on getting on and keep things as smooth with China, with the U.S. as they can. Dan, your question's a really interesting one about destroying supply chains. I think I have a pretty straightforward answer to that. One thing that Chinese are really good at is being pragmatic. And so when we see China lash out at an American company or a foreign company, or do an investigation, or detain somebody, or whatever, they've got this calculus that they go through about how do we minimize spillover effects onto other industries? How do we minimize collateral damage? And how do we avoid having the wrong people look at this and say, uh-oh, that could be me, I better change my posture, right? So China does this calculus about how bad is this going to hurt me versus how bad is this going to hurt them? And so I've always sort of been in the mind that they're not going to go after Apple as long as it would hurt China more than it would help China to go after Apple. I think that for Tesla, I think Tesla's an even more interesting case study, though, because they no longer need Tesla, but they also don't need to move dramatically against Tesla either. They could very easily, just let Tesla sort of die on its own in the sort of cutthroat, EV market in China. So I don't think that the going after a specific company supply chain is in China's sort of playbook, except in cases where there's an important example. And the classic case, of course, is H&M. Why do you go after H&M? Because nobody cares about H&M. It's not going to hurt their economy if it closes, and that country can't really hit back anyway. So you can go after H&M to make an example of them for compliance with a ban on Xinjiang cotton, but at the end of the day, it's going to send a message, but not much more. You can't do that with Apple. You can't do that with a pharmaceutical company. You can't do that with others. So I think they will continue to be choosy about who they sanction and go after.
Wow, that was very, very interesting, Sean. Thank you for that. What I learned was your first 5 points, that this U.S.-China relations, right? That there are ways China has figured out to hurt the U.S. U.S. tariffs on China are less impactful than they were before. China's economy isn't as fragile as many people thought. And the impact there is that this country will bind together, at least in the short run, and that the only market that matters is the U.S. market is not true anymore. And I think that that's something that I think we don't understand as much, and I think that's what you sort of brought to us as well as your other responses to our questions. So thank you, Sean.